For over 1,000 years, a single figure shaped the soul of Japan: the samurai, warriors forged in honor, sharpened by violence, and bound by a code that demanded not comfort, not mercy, but perfection. They lived in a world where loyalty was worth more than life, where a promise was stronger than steel, and where a man's final breath could be his greatest act. But behind the polished armor and sacred duty burned an even deeper fire, a hunger to be seen, not simply as a warrior, but as the warrior, the one whose name would echo across battlefields, whose courage would define an age, whose story would outlive death itself. This is the world of the samurai, a realm pulled apart by honor and ambition, loyalty and self-expression, tradition and transformation. And as Japan changed through war, peace, famine, rebellion, and rebirth, the samurai changed with it. They rose from clan warriors riding into foreign lands, to aristocrats shaping the empire, to generals ruling Japan from behind the throne. And eventually, they laid down their swords, traded their top knots for top hats, and stepped into a new world they never could have imagined. Welcome to Part 1. From Swords to Suits, the evolution of the samurai, a journey into the origins of Japan's greatest warriors, from their earliest footsteps on the battlefield to the moment they vanished into history. This is not just a story of war. It is the story of how legends are born, and how even the strongest must evolve or disappear. From Swords to Suits, the evolution of the samurai. The samurai were the legendary warriors of ancient Japan who lived noble and violent lives ruled by the demands of honor, personal integrity, and loyalty. These ideals became reality in the service the samurai gave to their feudal lords through government and to their commanders on the battlefield. It was duty that found its most elevated expression in death. Yet beneath these principles lay an even greater desire than the demands created by service to another. This was the need to be acknowledged, because if one reads between the lines in many accounts of samurai courage, the results suggest that loyalty to the group or to the leader had certain limits. In such instances, these boundaries were defined by a tremendous urge to be seen not just as a samurai, but the samurai through whose individual actions and skill the entire world of the warrior might be represented. As the following chapters will show, whatever aspect of his world we examine, we will discover a multi-layered realm that was constantly under pressure from the competing demands of loyalty and self-expression. At any moment in history, a resolution had to be found between the forces of change and the forces of stability. Together they shaped the world of the samurai. These tensions are most visible in the historical evolution of the samurai class. To demonstrate these forces at work, and also to provide a chronological framework for the theme chapters that make up the rest of this video, this chapter will consist of a rapid journey through samurai history, from the origins of the warrior class to its removal in the 19th century. In other words, it will be a short history of the samurai from swords to suits, from top knots to top hats. The ancestors, OFTHE samurai. Any exploration of the origins of the samurai has to operate along two dimensions. The first is to seek out the evidence for the beginnings of warfare in Japan. The second seeks a link between the use of controlled violence in Japanese society and the use of the word samurai to denote those who were carrying it out. Even a cursory glance at the evidence shows that there is a huge time gap between the two dimensions. To see the first, signs of warfare, we have to look towards the first few centuries AD. Although details are sparse about conflict in ancient Japan, the records kept by contemporary Chinese dynasties show considerable involvement by Japan in the affairs of Korea, where Japanese expeditionary forces took part in the wars between the three rival Korean kingdoms of Pech, Koguryo, and Silla. The first troops sent abroad by Japan fought only on foot, using bows, swords, and spears, and in about 400 an infantry. Army sent from Japan to support Pech was heavily defeated by a Koguryo army on horseback. Although horses were already being used in Japan as beasts of burden, this battle was Japan's first encounter with cavalry, and the experience must have been a profound one. Within a century of this event, there is archaeological evidence of horses being ridden in Japan, and it is not long before we read of mounted warriors heading from Japan for Korea. The reason that Japan was able to mount such expeditions with apparent ease lies in the developments that had been taking place in Japan itself. Out of several rival clans in Japan, one had emerged triumphant. The name by which the victors are known to history is Yamato, and they are key figures because the Yamato rulers are the ancestors of the Japanese imperial line. We know very little about the historical processes that took place to give power to the Yamato state, although many pointers have been gleaned from archaeology. Instead, the origins of the imperial line are contained in some very colorful legends, written down as a series of creation myths when the emperor system had become well established. They are preserved as the Koiki, the record of ancient events of 712, and the Nihongi, the chronicles of Japan of 720. These legends of gods and heroes tell us nothing of wars between tribesmen or of one clan dominating the others. Such activities have to be inferred from tales of gods slaying serpents in distant lands. The best known myth, and the one that is fundamental to understanding the imperial cult, tells how Amaterasu, the sun goddess, founded the Japanese imperial line when she sent her grandson down from heaven to rule the land of luxuriant rice fields. Myths aside, the power of these early rulers is vividly illustrated in Japan to this day by the coffin, the huge earthen tombs in which they were buried. They date from between the 4th and 7th centuries. They are often keyhole-shaped and occupy a huge area of land. Nowadays, the coffin are covered in trees, and some of the largest imperial tombs are islands in the middle of a lake. Armor, harness, weapons, bronze mirrors, and jewels were buried along with the deceased and have been recovered from the very few tombs that have been excavated. On top of the tombs or inside them were placed haniwa, primitive but lifelike clay models of soldiers, servants, and animals, which may have their origins as substitutes for human sacrifice. The actual origin of the dominant Yamato line is still a matter of some controversy based on the similarities between the grave goods in the coffin tombs and contemporary Korean burials. The theory has been advanced that the first Japanese emperors came from Korea and asserted their superiority in Japan through their use of mounted warfare. This is known as the horse rider theory. The notion calls into question the uniqueness of the Japanese imperial line, let alone the issue of the first emperor's heavenly ancestors. It has therefore never been popular with Japanese nationalists, and it is interesting to note that as a counter to this idea, one of the Yamato creation myths tells of a similar process happening in the opposite direction. when Empress Jingo led an invasion of Korea. The story relates how she was pregnant at the time and on her return gave birth to Emperor Ohin, later deified as Hachiman, the kami god of war. Many challenges were made by rival Uji, the ancient clans, against the dominance assumed by the Yamato rulers. All were ultimately unsuccessful, and by the 7th century the imperial line felt sufficiently secure to introduce far-reaching legislative changes for Japan. The Taika reforms of 646 were an ambitious set of edicts that sought to curtail any remaining power possessed by the surviving clans by making all of Japan subject to the emperor. One of the first tasks of the reform was to establish Japan's first permanent capital city. This was achieved after a couple of false starts at Nara in 710. Buddhism, introduced to Japan 2 centuries earlier, flourished in the settled conditions of Nara. The government of Japan, like the design of the capital itself, was modeled on Tang China, and for some time the combination of the two provided a stable society. Any dissatisfied clans, any individuals rebelling against the throne, or trouble from the recently pacified Emishi, tribesmen who had been pushed to the north over the centuries, were dealt with efficiently. Kyoto succeeded Nara as the imperial capital of Japan in 894, a position it was to keep until 1868. It is the means by which war was waged by the Nara and Heian Kyoto courts that is most interesting for our story, because the original Chinese model that Japan adopted was an army conscripted from the peasantry. This proved inadequate to deal with the situations that arose. So instead the government began to grant commissions to make war on local landowners and rewarded them generously for their trouble. So, instead of controlling the clans that had once been its rivals, the government's military needs now encouraged them. Their elite warriors, who rode horses, used bows, and were supported by tenants drafted as soldiers, were the foreigners of the samurai. The 9th century was not kind to Japan. It was a time of economic decline marked by plagues and episodes of starvation. These were factors that led to resentment against the central government, which an influential local ruler could exploit to his advantage. When riots, lawlessness, and localized opportunistic rebellions plagued Japan, there was nowhere else for the court to turn. By the beginning of the 10th century, the government was granting far-reaching powers to its provincial governors to levy troops from these skilled fighters and to act on their own initiative when disorder threatened. Delegated tax collection, family ties to the court, rewards for military service, and rivalry over official appointments all helped create a system that favored the strong and the rich and saw them grow stronger and richer. First samurai. The 10th century is the time that we first see the term samurai, which literally means those who serve, being used in a purely military context. At first it referred to men who went up to the capital to provide guard duty. In time it began to denote a military man who served any powerful landlord. The word rapidly acquired a strong aristocratic and hereditary aspect, so that samurai lineages began to be recognized and valued. Some were the descendants of the Uji, others were newly established families whose reputations were secured by military prowess and whose glorious pedigrees were just starting to be written. The service that the samurai families rendered to the Heian court made them even more wealthy and powerful, and by the 11th century 2 particularly strong clans had emerged. They were the Taira and the Minamoto, and their exploits were to dominate Japanese politics for the next 100 years. Samurai from the two families took part on both sides during the Shogun Rebellion of 1156, an armed encounter in Kyoto that was concerned with the imperial succession. It was not long before another succession dispute put the Taira and the Minamoto into direct opposition. The Taira were victorious in the struggle, the Heiji Rebellion of 1160, and disposed ruthlessly of their rivals. But in 1180, the survivors of the Minamoto Purge, key members of whom had been children spared by the Taira, reopened hostilities at the Battle of Uji. This was the first armed conflict in a war that was to become known as the Gempei War, from the Chinese reading of their names. Gen for the Minamoto Genji and Hai for the Taira hike. The Gempei War is fundamental to understanding samurai history. First, the battles that took place, such as Ichi no Tani, Yoshima, and Den no Ura, created benchmarks for samurai excellence that were to last for the whole of samurai history. Heroic tales and works of art logged the incidents in the Gempei War as a verbal and visual catalog of heroism that would show future generations the most noble, brave, and correct ways of being a samurai. Nearly all the factors that were to become indelible parts of samurai culture have a reference point somewhere within the Gempei War. Prowess at archery and hand-to-hand fighting, the juxtaposition of art, poetry, and violence, undying loyalty to one's lord, and the tremendous tradition of ritual suicide all have key passages and proof texts in the tales of the Gempei War. The other way in which the Gempei War made its mark on samurai history lay in the steps the victors took to confirm their triumph. In 1192, Minamoto Yoritomo took the title of shogun. This was the rank that had previously been bestowed temporarily on samurai leaders who had accepted an imperial commission to deal with rebels against the throne. Yoritomo, whose family was now unchallenged in Japan, took the title for himself for his new role as military dictator. The difference was that the temporary imperial commission had now become a permanent one and was not relinquished until another 8 centuries had passed and Japan had entered the modern age in 1868. The position of shogun was also made hereditary within the Minamoto family. Government exercised by the shogun was called the bikufu, name derived from the maku, the curtains that surrounded general's headquarters on a battlefield. It was a good choice for a new system of ruling that relegated the emperor to the position of figurehead with immense religious power, but no political power. The control of Japan's affairs now lay with the leader of the greatest family of samurai. Challenges to teach samurai. The Minamoto did not have long to enjoy their success. Yoritomo was killed in a riding accident in 1199, and their dynasty only lasted 2 more generations before they were overthrown by the Hojo. Out of respect for the tradition of the title staying with the Minamoto, the Hojo rulers styled themselves regents rather than shoguns. It was therefore the Hojo Shikken Regency, not the Minamoto Bikufu, that faced a brief attempt at imperial restoration in 1221. This was speedily dealt with, and another half-century was to pass before the Hojo took the brunt of a very different threat to the survival of Japan itself. The 13th century in continental Asia was the time of the Mongols. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, these fierce horsemen had broken out of the steppes and gone on to conquer distant lands. From Korea to Poland, Japan entered their sights in 1274 with a raid on the southern island of Kyushu. This was followed by a serious attempt at invasion in 1281. that was driven off by a combination of samurai bravery and a knockout blow delivered by the weather. The fateful storm was the famous kamikaze, the wind of the gods that destroyed the Mongol fleet as it lay at anchor. The repulse of the Mongols added a further set of reference points to sit alongside the experiences of the Gempei War in the world of the samurai. As late as 1945, the term kamikaze still had such a powerful resonance of the destruction of an invader that it was adopted as the name for the suicide pilots who crashed their planes onto American ships. The next major challenge posed to samurai hegemony during the 14th century came from a further attempt at imperial restoration. This movement, led by the energetic Emperor Go-Daigo, was ultimately no more successful than the brief venture of 1221. But its execution was more prolonged and succeeded in adding more names to the pantheon of samurai heroes and more glorious exploits to the litany of the Gempei War and the Mongol invasions. In particular, these Nambokucho Wars, or wars between the courts, so called because there were two rival emperors, produced one samurai who was to be celebrated for centuries because of his loyalty to the person of the emperor. His name was Kusunoki Masashige. When the imperial line was finally restored during the 19th century, he was the exemplar from history who was presented to the loyalist samurai as the ideal they should follow. Sadly for Masashige, his devotion to the imperial cause led to his suicide at the Battle of Minatogawa in 1336. The battle was fought against Masashige's advice, and the inevitable defeat that was the result of his obedience to the imperial will require the ultimate sacrifice. Go-Daigo's attempted coup had one other result, because when the Hojo regions were overthrown, the power gap was filled by the Ashikaga family. As they were of Minamoto descent, they re-established the Bikufu and ruled Japan as shoguns for the next 200 years. But once again, a single ruling family found it impossible to keep under control the numerous volatile and powerful samurai families. The 15th century in Japan is therefore a catalogue of apparently minor clan squabbles settled by force, until one such dispute affected the heart of government itself. This was the tragic Onin War, fought from 1467 to 1476. When the fighting was over, Kyoto was in ruins. The shogun was disgraced, and a number of civil wars were taking place elsewhere in Japan. And that concludes part 1 of our journey through the rise of the samurai. From the first footsteps of ancient warriors to the birth of a class that would shape a nation, we've only scratched the surface of a story far greater and far more deadly, because what comes next is even more extraordinary. The battles that forged legends, the clans that tore Japan apart, the warriors whose names are still spoken with awe. Part 2 will take you deeper into the fires where true samurai greatness was created. So if you want to continue this journey, if you want to witness how these warriors transformed into the most feared and respected force in Japanese history, then make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. Thank you for watching. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.